It is always a special joy to get to introduce Dr. John S. Hatcher at this fireside. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Hatcher was an English professor for 44 years, and he's currently a professor emeritus at the University of South Florida. He's published 25 books, which have been translated into French, Spanish, Italian, Chinese, German, and Norwegian. And he has published more than 100 poems and articles. He's been a guest lecturer at the University of Michigan, McGill University in Canada, the University of Maryland, Emory University, and Oxford University, and most importantly, at talks just like this one. It's not uncommon for Dr. Hatcher to be giving a talk just like this 3 times in a week. At previous times when he was speaking at this fireside, he talked about topics like prayer and meditation being an unending conversation with God, the ontology of the manifestation, right? Understanding Satan, sin, and salvation, and asking the ever important question, why the Creator creates. I think about the blessing that we've been given to, in the comfort of our own homes, ponder these caliber of theological questions, something that in ancient times you would need to travel to the topmost seminary to even have a chance of considering. And here we are, this man speaking tonight about the ever important question: how can we know and love an unknowable being? Dr. Hatcher, the floor is yours.
That was a very sweet introduction. I very much appreciate it, sincerely. It's a pleasure always to be here at the firesides that you have weekly. I'm going to read from some notes that I made, and then leave ample time for questions, because I can't imagine there won't be some. The topic that I'm going to speak on is somewhat derived from a book of mine that I've just finished and is currently going through the editorial process and should be published around August by the Association for Baha'i Studies, called The Body of God, a guide to the understanding of the Suri Hekel, which is a very important but abstruse tablet of Baha'u'llah. So I'm not going to talk on that particular tablet tonight, but I am going to talk about some of the quotes from it that relate to this topic. How do we know and worship God? In the first paragraph of what is called the most holy book, the Kitab-i Aqdas of Baha'u'llah, he asserts, as a sort of preamble to everything that follows, which includes the foundational guidance for both individuals and society as a whole, including a blueprint for a global commonwealth. He asserts 2 essential duties that the Creator requires of every individual in whatever faith they follow, whatever creed they profess, or whatever path they choose by which to gain access to their own spiritual development. And I'm going to read you that paragraph where Baha'u'llah states what those 2 duties are. The first duty prescribed by God for his servants is the recognition of him, who is the dayspring of his revelation and the fountain of his laws, who representeth the Godhead in both the kingdom of his cause and the world of creation. Whoso achieveth this duty hath attained to all good, and whoso is deprived thereof hath gone astray, though he be the author of every righteous deed. It behooveth everyone who reaches this most sublime station, this summit of transcendent glory, to observe every ordinance of him who is the desire of the world. These twin duties are inseparable. Neither is acceptable without the other. Now, that's very eloquent, but sometimes difficult language to understand on a first hearing. So for those of you who have not studied this paragraph before, let me just sort of summarize it as an axiom. And the axiom is simply, Baha'u'llah says, two obligations fall on the shoulders of everyone aspiring to become spiritual. One is the recognition of the manifestation for the day in which they live. And that would be the representative of God in that day. So Christ for his day, Muhammad for his day. Day in this case meaning not meaning a dispensation or an era, a period of time and spiritual development, the collective spiritual development of humankind. And he says that the second thing, once you recognize that who this individual is and accept that individual for what he claims to be, namely God's representative to provide new guidance, then the sign, if you will, that you have truly recognized this representative of God is to follow the laws and guidance that they provide. So for the Jews, that would have been the laws of Moses, for the Christians, the laws of Christ, for Muslims, the laws of Muhammad, and for Baha'is, the laws of Baha'u'llah. And the important part, or another part of that axiom, is that they are reciprocal, that neither is acceptable without the other. To put it in simple terms, your first obligation is to know God. Your second obligation is to do what God ordains for you to do. And it's not sufficient to do one without the other. So you can we can deal with that in the Q&A perhaps, because it's a very interesting idea of the reciprocity and also the increase, the way the interplay between these two actions occurs. And yet in his description, in Baha'u'llah's description, in Shoghi Effendi's description and his work, God Passes By, of Baha'u'llah's second most important work, the Kitab-i-Iqan, which is the Book of Certitude, which is the most important doctrinal work of the Baha'i faith. The Guardian, or Shoghi Effendi, says the following in summarizing some of the themes of that book. He says, within the compass of 200 pages, Baha'u'llah proclaims unequivocally the existence and oneness of a personal God, unknowable, inaccessible, the source of all revelation, eternal, omniscient, omnipresent, and almighty. Now, some of that's very comforting, particularly the part that God is the source of all revelation and is a personal God. This is something very important, that we believe that God actually is aware of and concerned with each of us individually. But another part of it seems kind of abstruse or difficult to understand in light of what we just said, namely, God is unknowable and inaccessible. Well, that brings me right to the topic I started with. How do we learn to know God? If we know God through recognizing his manifestations or prophets, well, of course, that's an answer in a sense, isn't it? But it seems contradictory to the extent that if God is inaccessible and unknowable, then how do we come to love God and do what he says, even if it's indirectly through these manifestations? According to the Baha'i writings, the manifestations of God represent the most refined and perfect access we have to God. To entering his presence is the term Baha'u'llah says. And it doesn't mean literal presence, obviously. It means the spiritual presence of God. And that's true whether in this life or in the afterlife. The Guardian, Shoghi Effendi, says the following: we will have experience of God's spirit through his prophets, in the next world. But God is too great for us to know without this intermediary. The prophets know God, but how is more than our human minds can grasp. We believe we attain in the next world to seeing the prophets. So this can be a point of clarification, or it can be further confusing in the sense that, well, that means we don't know God now, but we will know God in the afterlife. No, even in the afterlife, we will require the intermediary of these divine teachers who aren't just ontologically, they aren't just extremely informed or spiritually enlightened human beings. They are another order of being, the Baha'i writings make clear. Unlike normal human beings, they begin their lives in the realm of the spirit. They know what their purpose is. They don't need to be taught anything. They are inherently knowledgeable, and so on. We can get into that more into the Q&A, and we'll get into it a little more in my discussion. In a very important tablet that I've already mentioned, the one that I'm writing the book on, the Suri Hakel, which means the surah or chapter of the temple. And temple in this sense has obviously two meanings, the literal meaning of a place of worship, but it also alludes poetically or symbolically or metaphorically to the body. And so you could say that your human temple is your human body, with which Baha'is believe the soul associates. So we don't believe the human soul is in the body or even dependent on the body, but during our lifetime in this first part of our existence, in the physical realm, it associates with the body or expresses itself and learns through the body's experience. And so in this work, Baha'u'llah makes a very important statement about his own temple, his own person, if you will. He says, "Naught is seen in my temple, but the temple of God, and in my beauty, but his beauty, and in my being, but his being, and in myself, but his self, and in my movement, but his movement, and in my acquiescence, but his acquiescence, and in my pen, but his pen, the Almighty, the all-praised. There hath not been in my soul but the truth, and in myself naught could be seen but God." Now that may sound very ostentatious and haughty or so on, but as you will find out, these manifestations are very humble, very submissive to the will of God, and endure whatever we do to them, without asserting any sort of temporal power or desire for temporal power. Their purpose is to transform the spiritual tenor of society by degrees. So the religion of God, from a Baha'i point of view, is one, but revealed in progressive and successive stages. So Baha'u'llah is talking as the manifestation or teacher or intermediary for this stage, and each of them claims this same thing. Even when Christ is asked by Philip, he says, "Show us the Father," because Christ is about to leave them. He knows he's going to be crucified. And he says, you say you're going away to the Father. Show us who you're talking about. Show us the Father, and we'll be satisfied and know what you're talking about. And Christ responds, "Have I been with you so long and you do not know me? He who has seen me has seen the Father, for I am in the Father and the Father is in me." And yet in other places, he makes it clear that it doesn't mean literally he is the Father. He says, "I do nothing but on my own authority, but by the authority of him who sent me." So you have this, again, enigma, what Dan Jordan used to call delicious paradoxes we find in the faith, that we are exonerated to resolve. And so on the one hand, as Baha'u'llah says, when we see Baha'u'llah, and this doesn't mean literally, it means when we come to recognize him through his utterances and through his actions, because we know every important thing about his life, every detail of his life. So these two means, their utterances and their actions, are the means by which we learn, become close to the prophets, and the means by which, consequently or indirectly, we learn to know about God, because they are, to put it in the simplest terms possible, as perfect a representation of God and godliness as is possible in human form or in human understanding. In a similar vein, in a collection of Baha'u'llah's writings called The Gleanings, Baha'u'llah states the following: the essence of belief in divine unity, and this means the unity of the manifestation with God, that they are, that the Holy Spirit emanates from God and is conveyed to us through the manifestation. The essence of belief in divine unity consisteth in regarding him who is the manifestation of God, and him who is the invisible, the inaccessible, the unknowable essence, meaning God himself, as one and the same. Now, this doesn't mean, again, literally. So it doesn't mean that, in other words, this, of course, is what baffled and confused the early Christians when they tried to understand, well, what does that mean Christ was? Was he the Son of God? Or was he a prophet of God, a successor to Moses, the Messiah? Or was he God incarnate? Well, you can see why they would get confused, and you could see how someone reading this literally would also be confused. But then Baha'u'llah goes on to explain what he means. By this is meant that whatever pertaineth to the former, all his acts and doings, whatever he ordaineth or forbiddeth, should be considered in all their aspects and under all circumstances, and without any reservation, as identical with the will of God himself. So identical with the will of God, not that it is God, but effectively for us, it's as close to God as we can understand. And so nearness to God is achieved, according to the Baha'i writings, by our proximity to our understanding of and love of the manifestations. Well, how do we grow to love them? Well, how do you grow to love anyone? By coming to know them, by communing with them, having a relationship with them. And this is how this is done, is through prayer, through meditation, reflection, and first of all, by reading the writings. This is the heart of the revelation of the manifestations. So we get to the question that is foremost in the minds of many who question religion or the value of religion. And that is, why does God create in the first place, particularly physical reality? Or to put it in terms that are in the context of our own interest as spiritual beings, because Baha'is, as I've said before, believe that the essence of our own reality is spiritual, not physical, and that the spirit associates with the body, operates through the brain, if you will. The brain serves as an intermediary, but the soul is not in the brain. The brain is a function of, and so is the rational mind, a function of the soul. And so we ask the question, why did God choose to create us in a form that seems contrary to our destiny? And that is, if we're all going to become spiritual, or we are spiritual, but our bodies are all going to pass away, and we will continue, Baha'is believe, to live as spiritual beings and continue to grow, develop, and understand. We lose nothing of our identity that's important only the physical aspects of it. But our personality is from the beginning. Our essential reality, our identity, our consciousness is from the beginning and never ceases to exist. So if that's our destiny, the question becomes, why did God create us in the first place, but particularly why did he create us in an environment or an experience that we go through, what we're going to see later Abdu'l-Baha calls a workshop, which is our physical lives where we're working on ourselves spiritually. Why not just put us directly where we're going to end up in the first place and in the way that he wants us to be? Well, the obvious answer to that, particularly to those of you who are educators, is that you, to learn something, you have to become involved as a student. You have to use your free will. If you simply are told what to think or given factual information, that's not real learning. That's simply a recording machine of whatever sort, a video machine of whatever could do much better, be more accurate as a repository of information than your brain could. No, what our job is to participate in this process of our own education. And so we turn to probably one of the more important discussions in the theological enigmas of the Baha'i faith, and that is the hadith of the hidden treasure, which is commented on at length by Abdu'l-Baha and the commentary on this Islamic tradition. Well, what is that Islamic tradition? I was a hidden treasure. Well, the I speaking is God, and God is saying, I was hidden, but I wish to be made known. Thus, I called creation into being that I might be known. Well, that sounds kind of convoluted or difficult, so let me say it again. God is saying that he is alone or hidden or concealed, and he wishes to be known. Therefore, he brings creation into being. So there are beings capable of doing those two things we started with, knowing him and worship him. And I didn't say worship, I said doing what he says, but that is a form of worship. So if we pray every day as we are ordained to, and so on, this is a form of worship. Work, having a vocation, according to Baha'u'llah, is a form of worship. So all of the things we are bidden to do are forms of expressing our love of God. But I had a very interesting question come to me as an email from someone who attends my Wednesday night classes, and asked, or basically said, I am teaching someone about the Baha'i faith, but they have trouble, this individual has trouble believing in a narcissistic God. Which sounds like, well, that's a pretty presumptuous statement to make, but actually it makes sense. And that is because I remember very well when I was in the Methodist Church as a young man and hearing my minister say, we must love God because God needs our love. Well, that just, I almost stood up and raised my hand because it made no logical sense. If God is self-sufficient and omnipotent, God doesn't need our love. We need God's love. And this is the heart of what is being said here. God wishes to be known not for selfish reasons, but because it is God's wish to bestow upon us his gifts of love. So in other words, God is aware of what he has to bestow. The closest analogy I think we come to in human experience that I have come across is parenting, where we raise a child or have children, not because, unless we are perverted in some way or are narcissistic, we don't have children for our benefit. we want to express our love for them. But there's another axiom in the Baha'i faith that also applies to parenthood, and that is God says, love me that I may love thee. If thou lovest me not, my love can in no wise reach thee. And that's a very important axiom about love, and it works both between God and us and between ourselves and our children. We cannot impose love on them. You can't force someone to love you. You can do everything in the world to make them, the hope that they will want to love you, but you can't, it's free will. They may not, hopefully they will. But it's an incredible experience raising a child. And I think it's probably, of course, it's the most important job we will ever do. And it's the most difficult job we'll ever do if we do it well. And it very much parallels or enables us, I think, to just get a hint of the rationale between what we are doing, or the parallel between what we're doing as parents and what God is saying here. Baha'u'llah revealed a number of verses that say the same thing. I'll read a couple. For example, in one prayer revealed by Baha'u'llah, we find the following statement that testifies to God's desire to create a means by which, even though he is infinite and essentially unknowable, can be comprehended and subsequently loved and cherished for his beneficence, for his magnanimity, for his relentless love for us. This is the statement: lauded be thy name, O Lord my God. This is a prayer of Baha'u'llah to God. I testify that thou wast a hidden treasure, wrapped within thine immemorial being, and an impenetrable mystery, enshrined in thine own essence. The prayer continues by observing how the creation of physical reality has been devised as a means whereby we human beings can gain access to the attributes of this essentially unknowable reality that is the Creator. Now, this is the important distinction between the essence of God and the attributes of God. And I can explain it very simply by making a parallel once again to us as humans. The essence of our reality is our spiritual reality, our soul. When the body decays or dies or is veiled, our soul is veiled because we have aphasia or dementia or whatever. The soul is not affected thereby. It may be frustrated for that period of time, but the soul is doing well, is doing okay. And so we distinguish between what is our essential reality and what our attributes are. And so our attributes are our qualities of kindness, forgiveness, love, charity, justice, and so on. And so while we never know God directly, we know what he's like. And of course, knowing what someone or some being is like is really coming to know them. So in other words, we can't see this spiritual essence because the spiritual essence has no physical attributes. You can't perceive it with your senses. So the prayer goes on: wishing to reveal thyself, thou didst call into being the greater and lesser worlds. And greater, of course, would be the spiritual world. The lesser world would be the physical world. And didst choose man above all thy creatures, and didst make him a sign of both these worlds, O thou who art our Lord, the most compassionate. Well, these statements certainly seem to confirm our previous observation that in addition to the manifestation being our primary and most carefully designed means or access or path to God, and creation as a whole can also be considered as having a purpose of preparing this way in this sense. Baha'u'llah says that everything in creation, not just human beings, but everything in creation has something to teach us, that everything has a spiritual or underlying uh, uh, spiritual lesson implicit in it, whether it's as simple as a rock or as close to human beings as our pet animals, whatever level of development they may attain. The prayer concludes by stating forthrightly how the physical world, as the exact counterpart of the spiritual world, is the chosen method by which this reciprocal love relationship between ourselves and God can be instigated through the metaphorical nature of physical reality, as I've just described it. It is a counterpart, if you will, or a mirror of the spiritual realm. And in fact, Abdu'l-Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, says that the physical world is the exact counterpart of the spiritual world. But of course, in symbolic or metaphorical terms. So it is a counterpart. It is, if you will, a poetic expression of the spiritual world. But it's something that you have to learn how to see the spiritual lessons in your physical experience. And that's where, again, someone can give you the tools to do that, but it requires your free will and effort in order to utilize those tools and that guidance. It is clear in a number of places in the Baha'i writings that the entire focus of this complex and massive physical construct, that is the universe, which of course daily we find is more complex and more expansive than we had ever understood it to be, is an indirect teaching method, if you will, by which we use our free will to understand the nature of God and come to discern in the physical reality, the metaphysical or spiritual attributes, and implement them both in our personal action and in our social action. And this is another axiom, if you will, that is extremely important in the Baha'i concept of spirituality or spiritualization as a process that we can strive to attain. And that is, spirituality cannot be achieved individually without the interaction between ourselves and others. In other words, spiritualization is essentially a social enterprise. And it sort of flies in the face, if you will, of the concept of asceticism or mysticism, where one becomes a solitary being in a cave and spends one's life in prayer and so on in isolation. No, the idea behind that was to isolate oneself from the temptations of the flesh, from the temptations of the acquisition of physical things, and so forth. And so it was a noble effort and required a lot of discipline. But it, in order to, if you think of any spiritual virtue of import, but particularly justice, for example, which is certainly one of the most prized attributes, the most precious attribute, Baha'u'llah says, in the sight of God. Well, how do you learn justice? You can't do it on your own, because justice necessarily revolves around a relationship among people, or at least between one or two people. So justice, the exercise of it, the understanding of it, is contingent on our being involved with others. It's a reciprocal relationship. And another thing to understand about this process is that it is reciprocal in the sense that the more you exercise a virtue, such as justice, the more you come to understand it. Subsequently, the more you understand it, the more expansively and creatively you're able to express it. It is in this sense, then, that Abdu'l-Baha does call, this is in his tablet to Auguste Forel, very, very important tablet in discussing some of these very exquisite and abstruse subjects about the origin of creation and so forth. Where he calls the physical reality this great workshop. A classroom is a word I've used in my own writings. It's another useful metaphor. It is in the same context that Baha'u'llah comments in one of his meditations with God. He says, "Thou," speaking to God, "thou didst raise him," meaning mankind, "raise him up to occupy thy throne before all the people of thy creation. Thou didst enable him to unravel thy mysteries and to shine with the lights of thine inspiration and thy revelation, and to manifest thy names and thine attributes. Through him thou didst adorn the preamble of the book of thy creation. O thou who art the ruler of the universe, thou hast fashioned." So in other words, he's saying the reason for creation is the human being, not just to create a human being, but to create a being capable of discovering that hidden treasure that is the beauty of God, the love of God, the forgiveness of God, to become godlike ourselves to the extent we're able. Godlike or godly, I think, would be a more appropriate adjective. So in other words, Baha'u'llah is saying that the whole focus of creation is on the human being. This doesn't mean we should laud ourselves over the rest of creation, because our own education is dependent on seeing the integration of this whole system as one process. Another allusion to this same theme in this hadith of the hidden treasure is found in Baha'u'llah's hidden words, particularly in the Arabic hidden word number 4, where he makes the following statement, speaking in the voice of the Creator, and articulates the purpose of creation, emphasizing that the spiritual enlightenment and the social evolution of humankind is the object of the Creator's love. And it goes like this: "O Son of Man, I love thy creation, hence I created thee. Wherefore do thou love me, that I may name thy name and fill thy soul with the spirit of life." Now, again, any of these are like poems. They bear many readings and require a great deal of reflection. But the main thing I wanted you to get out of this one is going back to the comparison between parental love and God's love, in the sense that I love thy creation, hence I created thee. We do, if you think about it, love the child before it is born, or even before it is conceived. We have love to give, and we want to bring forth that being, that we might bestow that love. Why? Because it's the greatest joy that you have in this life, is to bestow your love on someone else. Even more explicit language regarding this same hadith of the hidden treasure is an authoritatively translated passage from Abdul Baha's commentary on this tradition, a statement which explicates both the nature of this wish to be known on the part of the Creator, as well as how that wish becomes fulfilled through this successive appearance of the manifestations over the course of our collective history. It goes like this: "O wayfarer in the path of the beloved, know thou that the main purpose of this holy tradition," that is the tradition of the hidden treasure, "is to make mention of the stages of God's concealment and manifestation within the embodiments of truth, they who are the dawning places of his all-glorious being." And the dawning places is capitalized because he's referring to the manifestations. Uh, for example, before the flame of the undying fire is lit and manifest, it existeth by itself within itself, in the hidden identity of the universal manifestation. And this is the stage of the hidden treasure. However, when the manifestation reveals himself, then the treasure is unfolded. So before the manifestation, you can say Christ before he is baptized by John the Baptist, or Moses before he comes down from Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments, or Baha'u'llah before he begins his ministry. Their treasury of the knowledge of God is concealed, is hidden. But then when they manifest it, both in their utterances and in their actions, then they are, then it becomes manifest. He goes on to say, and when the blessed tree is kindled by itself within itself, and we may think of the burning bush as a symbol of this, which no doubt it was, and that divine fire burneth by its essence within its essence, this is the stage of I wish to be made known. So in other words, you have the hidden stage, and then once Moses sees the burning bush or the manifestation makes himself known, this is the fulfillment of God's desire to be known. Abdul Baha'i then in this same commentary, and this is an authoritative translation, which you will find in the notes of the Kitabi Agdas. He continues to explain the next stage of the process, when it, the divine fire, shineth forth from the horizon of the universe with infinite divine names and attributes upon the contingent and placeless world. This constituteth the emergence of a new and wondrous creation, which correspondeth to the station of thus I called creation into being. So you have three stages there implicit in this hadith of the hidden treasure. When the treasure of knowledge of God, in other words, is hidden, when it becomes known, and then when it becomes manifested in the physical world, both on us as individuals and society as a whole. The ultimate outcome of that treasure, of course, from a Baha'i point of view, being the fulfillment of the revelation of Baha'u'llah with the what's called the golden age of the Baha'i dispensation, or the most great peace, in which the world will be one country with people joined together in one faith, and yet it is a participatory form of government and so on. A very interesting discussion we could have on the structure of that society and that administrative order that Baha'u'llah has designed. So as physical reality emanates from God, a process that is without beginning or ending in time, and that is while planet Earth had a beginning and will have an ending, the chain of causality is such that there has always been somewhere in the created universe the existence of humankind. Why? Because this wish or desire on the part of God doesn't have a point of beginning in time. It does have a point of beginning in the chain of causality. So in other words, if creation has always existed because God has always existed, this desire didn't suddenly come, one day God was saying, well, now I feel alone. No, God has always had this desire, and therefore this has always been occurring. And so there have always been planets on which there was human life going through more or less the same process that we are going through, just as even now there are doubtless countless planets where the same thing is occurring, though they might be in different stages of development, some more advanced than ourselves, some not so advanced. Stated then in terms of particularly the Suri Hakel, those of you who are familiar with it, the tablet or the surah of the temple. We become enamored with the Creator through our love of the manifestation, who is the temple of God, the perfect incarnation of all God's attributes and powers, expressed through the vehicle of a human persona living among us, in order that we might apprehend these abstruse metaphysical realities as they become accessible to us in human comportment, in their daily actions and interactions, and the explicit guidance contained in their laws, their ordinances, and their exhortations. And this is a quote from a prayer by Baha'u'llah. Praise be to thee, therefore, O my God, such praise as thou didst ascribe to thine own self, and which none except thee can either comprehend or reckon. Thou art he, O my Lord, who hath made known his own self unto me, at a time when thy servants have failed to recognize thee, servants who by virtue of the ties that bind them to thee have been ruling over all that dwell on earth and have been vaunting themselves over its people. Now, this is in a context that would take a long time to explain, and I won't bother at this point. Suffice it to say, Baha'u'llah is praising God in that he has, though able, there's one axiom in the faith that goes like this: only God can completely understand God, which makes sense when you think about it, in that God is essentially unknowable, and therefore the only being capable of knowing this being is God himself, knowing completely. But to a degree, he has made himself known unto me. This is Baha'u'llah speaking, at a time when the rest of the world is oblivious to you. And of course, Baha'u'llah wrote the kings and rulers of the world, admonishing them how they should disarm themselves and form a collective pact in order to bring about global peace and justice, something we see the world attempting to do at this moment as one nation oppresses the sovereignty of another nation. In this context, the Greek ancient admonition, those of you who've studied Socrates or just the Greek philosophy in general, one of the great axioms of Greek philosophy is know thyself. What does that mean? Why? Well, obviously, there's a wisdom in it, just in a general sense of you can't really do well in life unless you are aware of your capacities, your tendencies, and so on. So it has that practical application. But in the context we're talking, it has a deeper meaning. And here is how it is explained. In the light of purpose, human purpose, as we have described it, one of the observations by Baha'u'llah that we can take away from his from the commentary on this hadith is this: he who knoweth his self knoweth the Lord. And this is an Islamic tradition. He who knoweth himself, his self, knoweth his Lord. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to read you a lengthy passage with which I'll conclude, that where Baha'u'llah comments on this very concept. And that is, if he says, first of all, you can't even know your own essential reality, because the knowledge of the soul is something beyond what on this stage of your existence you can really appreciate and understand. And of course, scientists go nuts trying to figure out, well, how can a brain, which is a piece of meat composed of a whole bunch of neurons, evolve a concept of self and have free will and so on. And so they're at a loss to figure out how you can have consciousness that evolves out of a bunch of circuitry. And of course, the answer is it doesn't. the circuitry is a means by which something that is non-physical can communicate with physical reality. It is an intermediary. It is comparing it to physical objects that you can use. It's a transceiver for the soul. And here's the passage by Baha'u'llah. Consider the rational faculty with which God hath endowed the essence of man. Now, by rational faculty, this term is synonymous with the concept of soul. The rational faculty, in effect, is one of the aspects or powers of the soul. Examine thine own self, and behold how thy motion and stillness, thy will and purpose, thy sight and hearing, thy sense of smell and power of speech, and whatever else is related to or transcendeth thy physical senses or spiritual perceptions, all proceed from and owe their existence to this same faculty, the rational faculty or the soul. So closely are they related unto it that in less than the twinkling of an eye, its relationship to the human body be severed, each and every one of these senses will cease immediately to exercise its function and will be deprived of the power to manifest the evidences of its activity. And of course, this we know. So as soon as as death occurs, the soul functions on its own, and the senses of the body have no meaning, have no life. Wert thou to ponder in thine heart from now till the end that hath no end, and with all the concentrated intelligence and understanding which the greatest minds have attained in the past or will in the future, this divinely ordained and subtle reality, this sign of the revelation of the all-abiding, all-glorious God, thou wilt fail to comprehend its mystery or to appraise its virtue. And he's talking still about the soul. Having recognized thy powerlessness to attain an adequate understanding of that reality which abideth within thee, thou wilt readily admit the futility of such efforts as may be attempted by thee or any creatures to fathom the mystery of the living God, the day star of unfading glory, the ancient of everlasting days. This confession of helplessness, which mature contemplation must eventually impel every mind to make, is in itself the acme of human understanding and marketh the culmination of man's development. This is very reminiscent of Socrates saying the greatest knowledge you can have is the knowledge that you know nothing. And of course, he meant that, and this was a hyperbolic way of saying essentially this same thing. So, my friends, the fact is that we should enjoy the time we have individually in this physical experiment, even as Earth itself will enjoy the time it has left to develop collectively into a physical expression of spiritual virtue in creating a just human society on planet Earth. As far as I can discern from my reading, we have 21 more times to circle our galaxy, that is, our solar system does, but we have 5 billion years to ponder this purpose and to bring it into fruition. So hopefully we'll succeed. If not, nothing great is wasted thereby, because there are other planets that will succeed if we screw it up.